What's up, everyone? I'm Josh from the Menlo Park campus. It's great to be with you today. I want to tell you about a time from my sophomore year of high school. So when I was a sophomore in high school, everyone in our school took this test, which they called an aptitude test, which was like a mix between a personality test and standardized testing for everyone. It was like they compiled this test, which would ask you a variety of multiple choice questions. Things like, on an off day, would you like to A, go to the beach, B, read a book, C, build a robot, or D, trade stocks on Wall Street? And then after compiling all of your answers, it would give you this list of like 10 things based on your responses, which could be a possible job for you. So at this time in my life, I didn't actually have a lot of passions. And the people in my life were super supportive, but they never really pushed me to try out passions or to find new things to do. And they never really said like, you'd be an amazing submarine technician someday. So I was really stoked for this test because I was like, this will finally give me a little bit of direction in my life. So I remember my friends and I all got our results back, and I opened mine up, and at the very top of the list, I don't remember the other things, but at the very top of the list was magician. Now, absolutely no shade on magicians. In fact, I actually always had kind of secretly wanted to be a magician simply because I love watching magicians. But as someone who had never done magic before or answered a question on the test about magic, I really felt let down by these test results. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been discussing this question that is core to the life and soul of every person on this earth. And that is this: what am I meant to do with my life? Like, what is my purpose? And we've been looking at that question specifically through the lens of this guy named Moses, who's one of the most significant characters from the Old Testament of the Bible. Moses is a Hebrew man who grew up in the home of Pharaoh of Egypt until he was forced to run because, as Donovan talked about the last couple of weeks, he killed an Egyptian who was harming an Israelite slave. And while he's out in the desert, after he's fled, this giant, flaming, glowing bush starts talking to him, and we find out that it's God, that God is speaking to him, and God has a mission and a purpose for Moses, what we refer to in the Christian tradition as a calling. And a lot of you probably know what happens from there, right? Moses is like, let my people go. And Pharaoh is like, ha, 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 no, right? And then 10 plagues. And then finally Pharaoh's like, okay, fine, you can go. And that's where we pick up our story today. See, over the last 2 weeks, we've seen that God called Moses to a purpose. And then that purpose was affirmed by the passion that he already had to see his people freed, showing us that our passions are actually God-given. And he wants us to use those things, those passions we have, to bring his goodness into the world. And it's affirmed by his people, right? Moses had people in his life who said, yes, God has called you to this thing. I support you. Go, do it. And they supported him, even when he doubted himself and even doubted God. In Exodus 14, we see that the Israelites are on the run because Pharaoh has changed his mind about freeing them and sends his army to chase them down and bring them back. They're weaving their way through the desert to try and confuse the Egyptians when they come down out of this large canyon, and right in front of them is this huge body of water called the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea at its widest spot is about 190 miles wide. It's just under 10,000 feet deep. For context, 190 miles, that's about the distance from San Francisco to Lake Tahoe. So the Israelites are camped with the sea in front of them and the army chasing behind them. They are pinned in and they panic. It says in verse 10 that as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and there were the Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? Like, what have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, like, leave us alone, we'll just serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Them Israelites are sassy pants, you know what I mean? They're panicked. Imagine being Moses in this moment. Like, for sure, he felt fear too, right? I think in this moment, Moses was probably questioning himself. Everyone around him was like, oh yeah, big cool Moses, what's your plan now, dude? Like, this is your calling to lead us to die? Cool calling, man. Who do you think you are? And it's here that we actually see the third affirmation that God has called Moses. It's in his position, specifically between a loving and strong God and a broken and hurting people. These people are terrified. They don't know who they are. They don't know what the future holds. They're unsure where their next meal will come from or what will happen to their families. But God has called Moses not to be this sort of like knight in shining armor, but to be a representative for the life-giving grace that God wants to bring into this world and to these people. And this is one of the ways that you and I discern the purpose for our lives, discern what God is calling us to. And it's, do your passions and people affirm that the path you're choosing and the actions you're taking will bring life and grace to a hurting world? One theologian puts it this way. He says, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And so, affirmed in the calling that God has placed before him, Moses answers the people. He says, don't be afraid. Stand firm. You will see the deliverance of the Lord. He'll bring it to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you're never going to see them again. The Lord, he'll fight for you. You just need to be still. Moses speaks the wisdom, the grace, the strength, the life of the Lord over these fearful people. And then, as you may know or have seen in like the Prince of Egypt, right? This passage tells us that this massive wind comes down like this canyon out of the east and pushes the water to two sides so that there are these massive walls of water on either side, and the Israelites walk through all 190 miles on dry ground. As we wrap this series and you're thinking about the calling that God has placed on your life, which he has placed a calling on your life, do not doubt that. I wonder if you've ever considered the position that he's placed you in. Your families, your school, your friend groups, your clubs or sports teams. You are where you are on purpose. See, our passions, the people that God has placed in our lives, and this position that he's placed us in between a hurting world and a loving God. Amidst all these things, we have the sweet freedom to walk forward in trust that God has good plans for our lives. And you might have noticed, I did not become a magician, but my passions, like to listen to people's stories, to help them understand God's love for them and my people like my youth pastor and my life group, small group leaders, and my parents even. My position in my youth group, my schools, amongst my friends, these were all things that God used to guide me into seeing what he wanted for my life. And you know what? If I would have become an engineer or a salesman or a firefighter or a magician, I wouldn't have ruined God's plan for my life. So please, don't panic that you might miss this one perfect plan that God has. See, after they walk through the sea, Moses is up on a mountain getting some info from God. And when he comes back down, those same Israelites who just saw God create walls out of water, who passed through the sea on dry land, they decide they're tired of waiting. And they make a gold cow and they start worshiping it. So God is not thrilled. He tells them, clearly you are not ready to enter into this land to which I have called you. And so he makes them wander in the desert for 40 years to prepare them to be the kind of people who listen to God and where he's leading. But you know what? They still get there. Like, as hard as they tried to mess up God's calling for their lives, for their people, they couldn't, because true calling is based not on our ability, but on God's goodness. It just requires us walking forward with open hands and saying, God, inflame my passions. Speak through the people in my life and adjust my position to be the person that you're calling me to be. So now, as we head into life group, we want to give you the chance to ask your life group leader a question about how they've seen this play out in their lives. And so here's what we'd like you to ask them. How have you experienced God's purpose in your position? Meaning, how have you seen God position your life through work or school or family or whatever else so that he might use you to breathe life into this hurting world? Because as we said, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. We'll see you guys later.